For many years, the doors of the Summer Palace had been kept closed to foreigners. So an invitation to an audience with the Empress Dowager Cixi there came as a great surprise to Peking's foreign diplomatic community. What were the Empress Dowager's motives for this unaccustomed display of hospitality? To find the answers, please watch the 8th episode of Untold Stories from the Summer Palace.
When Emperor Guangxu was first placed under house arrest, he regularly vented his anger by throwing things about in his room. Empress Dowager Cixi's response was to have anything breakable removed, leaving only the most basic furniture. As for the food Emperor Guangxu was served, the standard was far worse than he was accustomed to. Much of it had gone off by the time it reached him, and nothing was ever hot. By contrast, Empress Dowager Cixi dined in grand style in the hall for listening to orioles. The extravagance was phenomenal. She was served at least 120 dishes at every meal, and more than 400 kinds of pastries were always available. Before every meal she was served dried fruit, fresh fruit, breadfruit and candied fruit. Today, it's hard to imagine the hall for listening to orioles being laid out with such a sumptuous banquet for just one person. The chef is preparing a dish called longevity duck. He's using exactly the same method as when it was made for Empress Dowager Cixi. The duck is first boiled, then braised in sauce before being minced. After being covered with a layer of shrimp meat and walnuts, it is finally deep fried. A line of eunuchs would bring the Empress Dowager's meal into the dining room. The chief eunuch, Li Lianying, would remove the cover from each dish and place it on a sideboard. He would sample every item before the Empress Dowager ate it. She would indicate which dishes she wanted, and a eunuch would bring them to her. Preparing so many dishes was in fact a long-standing practice at the Qing court. It was intended to prevent outsiders from knowing what the Empress Dowager's favorite foods were and using that information to harm her. Empress Dowager Cixi never ate more than 3 mouthfuls of any dish. She finished only a tiny part of the feasts prepared for her. When the Empress Dowager had eaten her fill, she invited the women of the imperial household to have the rest. They would enter, thank the Empress Dowager, and then circle the table, taking some food and eating it while standing. The Empress Dowager's meals at the Summer Palace were far more relaxed and informal than they were at the Forbidden City. There were 2 exquisite small tables in Le Show Hall at the Summer Palace. They were, in fact, fish tanks, and they were called fish tables. One of the Empress Dowager's greatest pleasures at the Summer Palace was to watch the fish swimming around on the fish tables while she dined. One summer day in 1900, disaster once again visited the Summer Palace. Before dawn on August the 12th, an 8-nation Allied army broke through the imperial defences at Tungzhou, just to the east of Beijing. It was the time of Zhongyuan Festival, when the Summer Palace would normally have been filled with the light of lanterns and the sound of music. But this year, only a few lotus-shaped lamps dotted Lake Kunming. Empress Dowager Cixi had come with Emperor Guangxu to the Summer Palace to escape the heat of Peking. But now, she was forced to hurry back to the Forbidden City. On August the 14th, 1900, the Allied army launched an all-out offensive against Peking. The city soon fell, and the Empress Dowager and the Emperor fled westward. The officials who had been left in charge of the Summer Palace were surprised to see 2 mule carts approaching. They ordered them to stop, and when the officials looked inside, they saw 2 peasants. None of them realized that the woman was Empress Dowager Cixi. For the Empress Dowager, her flight marked the beginning of a year spent living in exile. This was the 2nd time since 1860 that the Qing government had been forced to flee the capital. With Peking in the hands of the 8-nation alliance, the Summer Palace was once again looted. The electric generator and lighting equipment belonging to the Summer Palace Light Company was destroyed, and the deep water gas light on the pier on Lake Kunming was extinguished. It would be 4 years later, in 1904, that the lights at the Summer Palace were lit again. During these 4 years, the Summer Palace underwent changes that outsiders knew nothing about. These days, the Summer Palace is a major tourist attraction. The crowds of visitors stop in front of its various scenic spots to make a record of their visit. Back in the summer of the year 1900, people were also taking photographs of the Summer Palace. These people posed in front of Longevity Hill and relaxed in the shade of the marble boat. They bathed naked in Lake Kunming, and they marveled at all the magnificent buildings. Then they destroyed them. They filled carts with the mountains of priceless treasures they stole and destroyed the ones that were too big to carry. They brought with them rifles and cannon. They'd come uninvited from Russia, Italy, Britain, France, Germany, the United States, Japan, and Australia. Collectively, they were known as the 8-Nation Alliance. Their actions were virtually a reenactment of the atrocities committed by a joint Anglo-French force at the same place when it was known as Qingyuan, the Garden of Clear Ripples, in 1860. But this time, the looters didn't burn everything to the ground. For a year after the looting at the Summer Palace, the Russians, British and Japanese kept their soldiers billeted there. In 1901, the Qing government, acting under duress, signed the Boxer Protocol. In it, China was required to pay 450 million taels of silver as so-called war reparations to the 8 Allied nations. She was also forced to agree to a number of other humiliating conditions. In return, the 8-nation alliance withdrew from Peking. In the autumn of 1901, Empress Dowager Cixi and Emperor Guangxu returned to Peking from Xi'an, where they had taken refuge. Russian soldiers remained billeted in the Summer Palace right up until the day before their return. When they eventually left, there was not a single pane of glass anywhere in the Summer Palace that had not been broken. Just to the southeast of the Forbidden City is Dongjiao Minxiang Lane, the old legation quarter. Following the signing of the Boxer Protocol, this part of Beijing was like a small country within a country, one that ordinary Chinese could not enter. In October 1902, the various foreign consulates in China received an invitation. Diplomatic envoys and their wives were invited to an audience with Empress Dowager Cixi at the Summer Palace. However, rather than being delighted by this invitation, the envoys were extremely anxious. 2 years earlier, Empress Dowager Cixi had initially tried to suppress the Boxers, but following a sudden change of heart, she had ordered the Qing Imperial Army to lay siege to the legation quarter. With cannon fire pounding the quarter, the foreign legation staff took refuge in the church on Dongjiao Minxiang Lane, where they could do little more than pray for deliverance. They were finally saved after the Empress Dowager experienced another change of heart. But the legation personnel were still badly shaken by this incident when they received the Empress Dowager's invitation. Cixi was, for the foreign envoys and their wives, an object of hatred and fear, and someone whose actions were unpredictable. The foreign envoys had never before been invited to the Summer Palace. And yet, in the autumn of 1902, Cixi, with the wreckage left by the foreign invaders barely cleared away, was throwing open the doors of her home to them. The formal audience was held in Renshou Hall, the Hall of Benevolence and Longevity. The guests entered the Summer Palace by the East Gate. The Hall of Benevolence and Longevity was where Empress Dowager Cixi and Emperor Guangxu held court. On this day, the envoys and their wives for the first time set eyes on the Empress Dowager. The American envoy later wrote, "We were deeply impressed. This dignified woman who sat on the throne was the quintessential empress. Her eyes missed nothing, and we felt she could read our thoughts. The resentment we had felt vanished and was replaced by admiration for her dignified manner and the awe that the grand hall aroused in us. Almost unthinkingly, we bowed to her." The audience with Cixi lasted just 8 minutes. Afterwards, the guests were served a banquet in an adjoining hall. It was hosted by the Empress in Cixi's place. The guests, however, could tell from the sumptuous food and the meticulous preparation that the Empress Dowager was a gracious and attentive host. There were even Western tableware and pastries on the table. To the envoys and their wives, it seemed that the Empress Dowager was not as remote and unfeeling as they had thought. The event, though shrouded in diplomatic courtesy, managed to thaw the chill between the Empress Dowager and the foreigners. After that, audiences and various other events became regular occurrences at the Summer Palace. In accordance with the stipulations of the Boxer Protocol, the office in charge of the affairs of all nations was replaced with a foreign ministry. The great powers hoped the change would increase their influence with the Chinese authorities. In fact, following the change, Empress Dowager Cixi became personally involved in foreign affairs and held regular meetings with foreign envoys. A number of Chinese scholars who had studied abroad were recruited to join the Summer Palace's diplomatic office. Yu Gang was the Chinese ambassador to France at the time. He had 2 daughters, Deling and Rongling, and both had spent many years abroad. They were fluent in a number of foreign languages, were well educated, and felt at ease with palace protocol. When she heard about them, Empress Dowager Cixi invited them to the Summer Palace to help her with her contacts with foreigners. The 2 sisters, Deling and Rongling, brought a sense of Western style to the Summer Palace. Among other things, Cixi liked the French cosmetics and perfume they gave her, and she was happy to let the young women wear Western dresses, play the piano, and dance Western dances. Western-style hanging lights were even installed in some of the halls at the Summer Palace to make the foreign guests feel more at home. But it was events that took place the evening before one visit by a foreigner, the American military attaché, that made the biggest impression on Deling. The Empress Dowager ordered the jade Buddhas to be removed from a table in the Hall of Happiness and Longevity. Her reason was that foreigners should not be allowed to see these pure and holy articles in case they blemished them. A curtain with Buddhist deities printed on it was also removed on the grounds that it would be unlucky to let foreigners see it. Cixi also cautioned Derling and Rungling not to speak in the foreigner's presence. All this reveals the complexity and subtlety of Cixi's thinking. The contradictions in her actions seem to suggest that she initiated contacts with foreigners because she felt she had no alternative. It was a sacrifice she made out of diplomatic necessity. A steady stream of foreigners came to the Summer Palace. Some were even permitted to enter the Empress Dowager's private quarters. Referring to the deportment of the foreign visitors, Cixi said, "The manners of some of the wives leave much to be desired." They looked down on Chinese people. However, I quickly saw what kind of people they are, who are so self-satisfied about their level of civilization and education. To my mind, the Chinese are much more civilized than they are and have much better manners. With foreign guests visiting the Summer Palace so regularly, the Foreign Ministry established an office outside the East Gate. Between 1903 and 1908, Empress Dowager Cixi invited foreign envoys and officials to the Summer Palace several times a year, in some years more than 10 times. The most people she invited at one time was 98. The Summer Palace was transformed from Cixi's favourite place of escape to the leading stage for diplomatic work. When Beijing hosted the Olympic Games in 2008, the Chinese people finally realized a dream they had cherished for 100 years. However, a decision taken at the Summer Palace brought China into contact with the Olympics as early as 1904. In 1904, a 500-strong Chinese delegation traveled to St. Louis in the United States. The city was hosting the 3rd Olympiad and the 12th World Fair concurrently. The Olympics were in their infancy and a far cry from the huge spectacle they are today. In fact, the Games were little more than a sideshow to the World Fair. The Chinese delegation was led by Prince Bo Lun. They were there to attend the World Fair, where they built a lavish pavilion at great expense to showcase Chinese culture. The Chinese pavilion and the exhibits it housed were widely admired. The Qing government was facing a dual threat from domestic instability and foreign aggression. The decision to raise the country's international profile was not taken lightly. Since signing the Boxer Protocol, China had seen its economy and military capability steadily decline, and the great powers were turning greedy eyes on the country. To the Qing rulers, it seemed the only hope for national salvation lay with diplomacy. The 12th World Fair was held at the time when a diplomatic charm offensive was being waged from the Summer Palace. Empress Dowager Cixi personally made the decision that China should attend the World Fair. She even appointed herself as the spokesperson who would present China's image to the world. Sarah Conger, wife of the American envoy to China, visited the Summer Palace several times. She knew Cixi well and admired her. As a way of letting the American people get to know the Empress Dowager, Mrs. Conger urged Cixi to sit for a portrait, which would be exhibited at the World Fair. Empress Dowager Cixi was the most eminent woman in China, and she rarely allowed other Chinese, let alone foreigners, to see her. However, compelled by diplomatic necessity, she made an unprecedented decision and agreed to Mrs. Conger's suggestion. And so, an American artist by the name of Catherine Carl was welcomed to the Summer Palace by the Empress Dowager. Arrangements were made for Catherine Carl to stay at a residence outside the Summer Palace so that she could come and go at the Empress Dowager's convenience. Carl spent nearly 10 months at the Summer Palace working on the portrait.
The American artist Catherine Carl was mesmerized by the Summer Palace, its beautiful gardens, and the extravagant lifestyle of its inhabitants. But why was Empress Dowager Cixi so keen to host the foreign artists there? And why was the tottering Qing government so determined to make a spectacular impression at the 1904 World Fair? All is revealed in the 9th episode of Untold Stories from the Summer Palace.